Let's turn now to the reaction to the story. Did you have a sense when doing the story of the magnitude of the report and the reaction that it might get? And then once the story was out, were you aware of what a sensation it caused in the United States?
I did not have it. I confess to you that at the time it was an interesting story. I think an important story. I had not a clue it would cause the kind of reaction and response that it apparently did. When I say apparently, I wasn't here. I was 13,000 miles away, where at a time when communications were terrible. Phone lines were useless, and trying to get a regular long-distance call through was near impossible. There was no cable; it was all done by radio, and weather conditions made communications near impossible. That's why we used to do radio reports every evening for the morning broadcasts, and a good part of the time they were just unintelligible, and they would read your reports on the air as opposed to hearing one's voice. So communications were awful. We had even the telex system was something called a slow scan system, which meant kind of a line a minute. It was a very slow ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk telex. It wasn't the rapid telexes that we even then were used to in more developed parts of the world. So it plus the time difference of whatever it is, 13 hours or something, made communications very difficult. So that any reaction that occurred in the United States was very slow in getting back to us in Saigon. And I don't think I was even in Saigon. I was still up in Da Nang, which meant even further delay.
Well, now, how aware were you then of the reaction within the Defense Department? You just took a look at the letter that Assistant Secretary of Defense Arthur Sylvester wrote to Fred Friendly, who was then president of CBS News. How aware were you of the attacks that were being made on you, and the questions that were being raised by Sylvester and others?
I don't know. It probably took a couple of days for me to become aware. I can't. What is the date of Fred's?
Fred's letter was written, I think, August 16th.
And the Camnay was August 12th?
It was earlier. It was I think, the first week in August.
Beginning of August. Well, it took probably 2, 3, 4 days for me to become aware of big reaction of any kind by the Pentagon. I do recall getting a call from a friend at the embassy, at the U.S. Embassy, saying, who I then went and had a coffee with, who said Westmoreland is pissed beyond belief. And I said, pissed at who? And he said, at you, but more importantly at General Walt, who was the commander of all the Marines in Vietnam, and apparently had chewed General Walt out. I think at this point, this was probably a good several days, because Westmoreland had gotten a copy of the tape that the Pentagon had sent him, or somebody had sent him in Washington, sent him a copy of the tape of the broadcast. And that's what pissed him off. It wasn't the signals that were going back and forth. It was seeing the story.
And to what extent were you aware of what, for want of a better term, we'll call the smear campaign against you? And can you describe that, the charges that were made by Sylvester and
again,
others?
I was getting this, delayed and possibly to some extent garbled reports, that I had been been on an unfriendly basis or worse with the Canadian military establishment. And I cannot honestly, at this point, 35 years later, think of any military stories I covered. The only ones I covered were the use of Canadian troops in the first United Nations Emergency Force in the Middle East, which was by any measure an upbeat story, as I recall. Canadian forces weren't exactly out there in the world fighting wars in the 1960s, with the exception of these then, in most people's view, noble UN missions. And so, for Sylvester claiming that he has his friends in the Canadian military establishment say I had a record of being unfriendly to the military is pure smear and pure invention. And then later on, there were allegations that I was a KGB agent, that I was a well-known communist, that Johnson is alleged to have told Moyers that I was a communist. Moyers tried to explain, apparently, that I was Canadian, and somehow Johnson thought the terms were interchangeable. But there clearly it was a concerted campaign in rereading Sylvester's letter, which just confirms it, that this was a gross attempt at defamation. Now,
How did you feel at the time? How did you react?
Well, look, I mean, there was animosity, no question, between the Pentagon and the press in Vietnam. I mean, forget Cam Ney. I mean, just in general, there was, and Arthur Sylvester was a man who was incapable of speaking in what we might call reasonable, not in diplomatic terms, but in reasonable terms. Let's talk about this, fellas. He was an attack dog, and we'd had a few moments with Sylvester. And I say we, the reporters in Saigon, in Vietnam, and he was pretty plain, pretty brutal, that they were going to go to every end to discredit us, because he felt we were going to every end to discredit them. We certainly did not go to. You will find, what's interesting to me about this idea that exists, that is still current in the U.S. military, is that somehow the press lost Vietnam. And if you go back and look, it's a major chore, at the reportage coming from the main media sources, New York Times, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, AP, UPI, CBS, NBC, ABC, you will find a preponderance of what a reasonable person would regard as positive stories, whether it was in the treatment of civilians in terms of civil action, which we all covered, and I covered plenty of, by the Marines, going out, bringing in fresh, clean water, bringing in medical help, helping villagers. Some of it was done for purely PR reasons, but an awful lot of it, most of it, was done for straight humanitarian reasons. And I constantly challenge whenever I deal in these days with military who come after me over this in a fairly friendly way. I should I say, look at the balance of stories. You know, not just from me, but from anybody who is out there on a open-ended assignment.